It's the early hours of Thursday morning, and I'm in the studio again because it's another emergency edition again, but with real vigour this time because Joe Biden has spoken to the American people, and he doesn't often do that, and he had, of course, a very big question to answer. Why has he dropped out of the race for another 4 years in the White House? That is the question he told Americans he would answer in this address. Let's see if he did.
When you elected me to this office, I promised to always level with you, to tell you the truth. And the truth, the sacred cause of this country, is larger than any one of us. And those of us who cherish that cause, cherish it so much, a cause of American democracy itself, must unite to protect it. You know, in recent weeks, it's become clear to me that I need to unite my party in this critical endeavor. I believe my record as president, my leadership in the world, my vision for America's future, all merited a second term. But nothing can come in the way of saving our democracy. That includes personal ambition. So I've decided the best way forward is to pass the torch to a new generation. That's the best way to unite our nation. You know, there is a time and a place for long years of experience in public life. There's also a time and a place for new voices, fresh voices, yes, younger voices. And that time and place is now.
But why is it now? Welcome to Americast.
Americast from BBC News.
Hello, it's Justin in the worldwide headquarters of Americast in London, England.
Joined by Adam Fleming, host of Newscast, the BBC's daily news podcast. And this has become daily news for us as well.
Yes, it's a pleasure to see you, Adam, as ever. Look, here's the thing. Joe Biden doesn't often talk to the American people, doesn't often give press conferences, doesn't often speak from the Oval Office. So it's a highly unusual event. Any time that a president sits behind that desk in the Oval Office, it's a big deal. It's a big deal for America. And this was a hugely big deal because although we knew the tone of what he was going to say and we knew the reason why he was there saying it, what we didn't know is the extent to which he would delve into the reasons behind his decision not to stand for another 4 years, and kind of what he'd say also about Kamala Harris. I think that's the really important thing. So he had to kind of strike a tone where he talked about the future, didn't do any damage to the woman who's going to be taking over from him as the candidate, but also talked a little bit about himself. And the danger with Joe Biden, as ever, is that he gets the balance wrong, talks too much about himself and not enough about her.
And also the usual gaffes that we got used to, like we need to cherish our democracy. Cherish. I should just say, though, that when they do these presidential addresses from the Oval Office, and you must have watched loads of them in all sorts of different situations when you were there, it's on every channel, isn't it? Yeah. Pretty much. You sort of can't escape it. It's like a proper, kind of movie moment.
Which is why Donald Trump asked for equal time. He's not going to get it. But yeah, it really does sort of hit home into the mainstream of America. Except that, as we know, TV is not what it was.
No, exactly.
It never was going to catch on, and it hasn't caught on. And there we are. People aren't. So, they'll see clips of it, a bit like the debate performance and all the other things that happen on live television now. Actually, the audience, I wonder what it was. I think people might have snapped on a little bit if they happened to be by a TV, but it's not the audience that it wants.
And just to paint a picture of how it looked, he sat at the huge desk by himself. There was massive gold curtains behind him. On the desk behind him, on the table behind him, there's various pictures of his family. And he himself, I hate to be superficial here, but there was a lot of fake tan there. I think back to the last time I watched clips of Joe Biden at 4 o'clock in the morning. It was after that first debate, and he looked almost like translucent. He did not look well. Whereas here, he looked like somebody who just spent 5 days at the beach, because that's where he's been, where he was isolating with COVID.
Yeah, he looked like an elderly man who's recently been ill. And his doctor says he's fine now and he's feeling okay. But actually, that is how he looks, and there's no escape from it. And there's that sort of sense. The other thing that really caught my attention looking at it, he doesn't blink. And that that is a weird thing, isn't it? When you are faced with someone who doesn't blink,
I'm now worrying about how often I'm blinking.
and you're blinking normally,
Yeah,
Adam, and so we're able to have a conversation. But actually, if you stopped, it's weird how that does have an effect on a conversation. Two
And
people
also
one
his
to one.
voice is just so weak. And I hate to be superficial because we should judge people on their actions and things like that. But it's not easy to listen to him when he's talking for more than a couple of minutes.
Yeah. And
What's interesting for me is after the speech, I was then looking online and you see in the Oval Office, he was surrounded as he was doing the address by his wife, his family, his grandkids, his staff. And then he went out of the Oval Office into the back garden of the White House. And there's hundreds and hundreds of his staff who are cheering, clapping, some of them looking a bit tearful, and they're all going to tuck into pizza and ice cream. And it just got me thinking, hang on. When I actually watched the speech on the White House YouTube channel, he looked really lonely and alone. And it made me just think, hang on, does what actually I saw marry up with what was really going on? So actually, it was a man who looked like he was sat there on his own, but actually he was surrounded by his friends and family and staff who clearly love him. So that sort of didn't marry up. It was somebody who sounded like they were resigning from the Oval Office as the office of president, but they weren't. He's just resigning as a candidate for an election in a few months' time, and he's still going to lead the country for another 6 months. And it was meant to sort of presumably be an endorsement of Kamala Harris, but she only really got one sentence. And then you think, well, the whole thing, was it honest? Because he sounded like somebody who was, or he wanted to portray himself as somebody who was selflessly and with no vanity giving up the job he loved. But we know that he clung on to it to the last possible second and was forced out. And you're just like, why do none of these things sort of marry up with the reality?
I think you completely put your finger on the difficulty that the Biden administration has faced really in the last year or so, which is that the American people who got there way, way before the political class did, said, you're not up to doing this. You're certainly not up to running for the presidency again. And it's worth saying as well, they also think that about Donald Trump. And yet they were told again and again, he's sharp as a tack, et cetera, is on it, is doing this, is doing that. It's a complete disconnect between what people can see with their eyes and what there is being suggested to them, all the way down, exactly as you say, to this weird event where on the one hand it seems very solemn and sad, and on the other hand they're trying to say, yeah, it's wonderful, we're celebrating Joe's next 6 months. The fact is, he's a lame duck. I mean, that is the phrase, and every president pretty much in the modern era who's faced the end of their presidency, including at the end of 2 terms, actually, but particularly you think of Lyndon Johnson at the end of 1 term back in 1968. He said, OK, I'm going to concentrate now on ending the Vietnam War. Well, how did that go? Not very well, largely because the North Vietnamese, who were going to be his negotiating partners in ending the Vietnamese War, thought, oh, hang on a second, he's not going to be around for much longer. We'll wait and see who the next guy is. And that's what happens. It happens on the big world stage. It also happens in local American politics, in domestic American politics. Power ebbs away. It's this weird alchemy. It's gone.
Well, and also that's the other thing. I thought at the start of the week, this was going to be a huge moment. One of those ones where you think, oh, I'll remember where I was when I watched the speech where Joe Biden stood down. But actually, because the future comes at you quickly and everyone moves on, particularly in American politics, it felt sort of not as big a deal as I thought it would do.
I mean, the fact is that the assassination attempt on a presidential candidate, however many days ago it was, has now been subsumed into a great maelstrom of other stuff.
Back to your point about lame duckery, though, it is interesting because I'm no expert on this, but I think that the lame duck label gets attached to you after 2 years, doesn't it? In a term, so halfway through what's going to be your final term as president, whether that's 1 or 2. And I suppose Joe Biden has managed to avoid that. Because he was going to run.
His lame duck period.
Yeah, his lame duckery actually probably only really kicked in kind of maybe in January this year when people were starting to really talk about whether he had it in him or to carry on or not. So actually, suppose he sort of bought himself maybe another year of being taken seriously.
Yeah. I mean, certainly they would say that he has been taken seriously as a president on the world stage, and these, that they would point to the NATO summit that they've just held. and to the various decisions made at that summit. And they would say Joe Biden, I think he said, didn't he, leading the free world, or leading the world, I think he just said at one stage.
The whole world, yeah. Right, let's listen to a bit more of him. And this is one of the things he did quite often in the address was just to link himself, not very subtly, to all the great presidents of the past, whether it was Roosevelt, Lincoln, Washington, or in this case, he was talking about one of the founding fathers. And actually, he was referring to a quotation from one of the founding fathers, which he has on the wall of his office.
When Ben Franklin was asked, as he emerged from the convention going on, whether the founders have given America a monarchy or republic, Franklin's response was a republic, if you can keep it. A republic, if you can keep it. Whether we keep our republic is now in your hands. My fellow Americans, it's been the privilege of my life to serve this nation for over 50 years. Nowhere else on earth could a kid with a stutter from modest beginnings in Scranton, Pennsylvania, and Claremont, Delaware, one day sit behind the resolute desk in the Oval Office as President of the United States. But here I am. That's what's so special about America.
Justin, 2 questions for you, which you can answer in any order. One, does that kind of soaring presidential rhetoric actually still work in 2024 when actually you've got 40 million American voters communicate via the means of brat memes? Number one. Number two, as a piece of electioneering, this address was all about Donald Trump is a threat to democracy. If you vote for Donald Trump, it's the end of American democracy. You've got to vote Democrat if you want to save democracy. Do you think that works as the main election slogan?
Okay, so two things. I'll take the second one first,
Please do.
actually. Kamala Harris is now the presumptive Democratic nominee for the presidency. He mentioned her once, as you said. He mentioned Benjamin Franklin more, actually. I mean, that passage about
Can I vote for him?
So when it comes to democracy and the founding fathers and the kind of weighty stuff about America, he was much keener to talk about that than he was about Kamala Harris. He said nice things about it, but they were encapsulated in one sentence. I think it will occur to a lot of Democrats that maybe that balance is wrong, and it should be more about the future and less about the past, and certainly the distant past. And certainly that phrase from Benjamin Franklin about a republic if you can keep it, which frankly is, and this goes to your first point, is actually a bit kind of boilerplate. I mean, all Americans know it. I don't think many of them know what it means. It doesn't occur in your daily life when you're filling up your truck with gas at the local gas station, petrol, I should say, and it's expensive. Or you're having difficulty buying groceries because of recent inflation. Or, and this is a really crucial thing, you feel that the current republic is under threat because of the huge number of illegal immigrants coming in through the southern border. All of those things, of course, are not addressed when you talk about Benjamin Franklin, because that was a long time ago. And I think exactly to your point, I think there's a real risk that all of this sort of rather airy-fairy rhetorical stuff doesn't address. It's not that it doesn't work in the age of memes, etc. It just doesn't address the actual problems that real Americans have today. And that, frankly, has been the Biden issue during this whole campaign, even when he thought he was going to be the candidate and he thought he was going to win.
You very cleverly answered both questions in one answer, because
kind of
they actually are, because they are related.
They are related. They're definitely related. Yeah. And there's also an oddness about it. At one stage, he mentions reforming the Supreme Court.
Yeah.
Now, here's the problem with that sort of stuff. And this goes back to the lame duckery, but it's kind of more important than the lame duckery issue. To what extent is he going to do things now that get in the way of Kamala Harris politically? To what extent is he going to promise to do stuff, you think of Israel Gaza, that she might not want to do, or she might want to emphasize in a different way? And I did think with the Supreme Court, so a lot of Democrats are really hacked off with the Supreme Court. They think that it's fixed. They think that the way the Supreme Court justices are chosen in a Senate that is very much skewed towards the Republicans because it favors small states, because of the way that every state has 2 senators. Even California has the same 2 senators as Oklahoma, although California has zillions more people, et cetera, et cetera. So they think the whole system for getting the Supreme Court in the first place is a mess and should be reformed. They also think the existing Supreme Court, the one that got rid of Roe v. Wade and has made all sorts of other decisions recently that seem to benefit Donald Trump, they think that the Supreme Court is behaving badly. And many of them, and it's absolutely true, would like to reform the Supreme Court. But what does that mean? Does it mean packing it? Because it doesn't have to be 9 justices, which it is at the moment. You could have 56. But that's a very big deal to suddenly go down that road. And if he's hinting at going down that road, does Kamala Harris going into an election, a very close election, does she want to be saddled with either agreeing or disagreeing now with Joe? So all those kind of issues suddenly come to the fore.
And also, if your whole election is about preserving democracy and then you start basically fiddling with one of the institutions that's meant to be the guard of democracy in a way that looks partisan and in your benefit, that's sort of, again, another thing where reality and what you're attempting to do don't quite marry up, like I was saying at the beginning. Although it was interesting, I noticed, I can't remember the exact word he used about what he's going to do about the Supreme. Was it like talk about or propose or showcase reform? It was a weasel word. It wasn't like an action.
It just wasn't.
Word.
It wasn't clear. It wasn't clear, and it wasn't fleshed out. And if you bring up things like that, you are going to have to then. Well, I mean, are you going to have to act on them? Do you just forget about it? Is it something that's just gone out into the ether? But I think that, to me, points to a potential difficulty over the next 6 months, which is not that Joe Biden can't do anything, although that's one of the difficulties, is that if he does select 1 or 2 things that he does want to do, they've got to fit into Kamala Harris's agenda.
So when was the last time we had that weird power balance where the Democrat candidate wasn't the Democrat president and you had like rival power centers in an election?
I'll tell you a really good example.
When was it?
Is Clinton Gore. So Al Gore is running for the presidency. He's been Clinton's vice president.
Yeah.
And they have this really difficult thing where does he own the Clinton presidency?
Yes.
Or does he not? Should he be set free to be his own man? And actually, in the end, he owned it. And a lot of... And actually, in the end, he owned it. And a lot of Democrats feel, in retrospect, he, of course, very narrowly lost. They won the popular vote. But a lot of Democrats feel, in retrospect, actually, he should have been his own man. And he should have ploughed his own furrow and he should have avoided being... But it's a really difficult one, isn't it? You know, what vice president would say of the president that they've just been serving, you know what, I'm going to level with the American people now. He's an idiot. I never really backed any of this. He kept me out of all the main decisions. I want to do X, Y, and Z, and let's forget about those last ones. It doesn't tend to happen, and for perfectly obvious reasons. So this relationship over the next period up until the election between Harris and Biden is a really tricky one, a really difficult one to organise.
Right, let's hear from US editor and fellow Americaster Sarah Smith, who sent us this voice note.
Hi there, Americast and Newscast. It's Sarah here in Washington, where I was able to watch President Biden's address at home, just like millions of other Americans sitting on the sofa watching the TV. Watching President Biden giving this address, I thought it was really obvious from his demeanour, from his expression, from his tone, that he was not happy about having to do this. I mean, it was his own decision not to run for re-election that he made at the weekend, but that was only, 3 days ago or so, and he pretty obviously hasn't come to terms with it yet. His family were all lined up in the Oval Office there to support him in what is a very, very big moment. His wife was there, as was his children, Hunter and Ashley, and several of his grandchildren, and the closest members of his staff as well. So obviously they were out of the camera shot, but they were kind of lining the curved walls of the Oval Office, and they all burst into applause when he finished, apparently. And you can see why this would be a very, very emotional moment for him. You know, he waited so long to get the presidency, and now he's having to give it up earlier than he thinks he ought to. I mean, it's pretty clear he thinks he's got another 4 years in him still. Yet everything about this address, the way he was stumbling over his words a bit, the lack of energy and vigour in it, the way he just wasn't really delivering the soaring rhetoric that had been written for him, it just showed you why it is the right thing that he's stepping aside and why he wouldn't be successful in campaigning for another 4 years in office. So he kind of proved his own point, whilst at the same time looking a bit miserable about it. So what did you guys think of that? Was this enough to put him in the sort of George Washington league of presidents who nobly stood aside in the cause of democracy?
I feel we've answered some of those questions, Sarah, but thanks for reinforcing them again.
Yeah, he's not in the George Washington League, is he? I just think. I mean, we can answer that. He's
really no
not.
one is, though.
No.
So,
well, there we are. I mean, he's not. But I do think there's a real there's a kind of Trump problem about Joe Biden, which is that he's morphed in recent times into someone who is more self-regarding than we generally assumed that he was. His persona, grandfatherly. I got to do this job to save the republic. I'm a nice, gentle, kind person. I can act decisively when I need to, but whatever. That has been quite damaged, I think, by the last 6 months or so, where he has seemed, number one, to be clinging on to a job, the job of trying to get re-elected that he didn't seem capable of doing. But number two, that it became kind of very much about him and his own legacy and all the rest of it. We know behind the scenes he's very involved with historians. He wants to write history, as Churchill said, because it'll be kind to me if I write it. And he's very keen to write his own history with the help of historians. He's very keen on legacy stuff, and so is his family. But you'd keep that to one side, I think, if you were more politically astute.
What's that? Is it F. Scott Fitzgerald quote about there are no second acts in American lives? I mean, this is his fourth or fifth act. So actually, he's certainly bucked. He's disproved that.
Yeah, it's the kind of greatest quote about America that isn't true, isn't it? People trot it out. And I don't think F. Scott Fitzgerald quite meant it in the way that we use it. But of course, the whole thing about America is you can have as many acts as you can cram in, and they do. And it's worth saying, have we been a bit unkind about him? I mean, it's an extraordinary political career, and it started with a bang with this amazing 1972 Senate run against a Republican. He had absolutely no chance of winning. And he turned it around. And the polls, I think he was sort of 20 or 30 percentage points behind. And he turned it around and won by a few thousand votes. And that kind of has coloured his whole life. This scrappy Joe is able to do stuff. And you can see, if you're being kind to him, at the end of it all, that moment sitting in the Oval Office, in a sense vanquished by Donald Trump. I mean, he'd be upset at that characterization, but Trump is still going strong and he's not, and that will really hurt him. And after this extraordinary life, and also, of course, the personal side of it, the loss of his wife and child, and the injury to the two brothers early on in that car crash, the awful kind of tragedies that he's had more recently, Bo, his son, dying of brain cancer. This kind of, and Hunter, his other son, who has been a drug addict, this kind of sense that this is a man who's always scrappily fought back and now can't fight back anymore. And that moment of sadness, you can feel for him, whatever the politics of it, on a human level. It is extraordinary to watch it all kind of coming to an end, really.
And also that story, which sounds like the most amazing kind of HBO 10-part series, compared with Kamala Harris's backstory, which is a sort of like effortless escalator ride up through the ranks in a way. And I'm sure she's had challenges, and I'm sure it's been hard for her in various aspects, but actually in comparison looks effortless and looks a bit profesh.
So I tell you, right at the beginning of the Biden presidency, they thought they'd use Kamala Harris in a way you usually use the vice president, which is you send the vice president to Congress, to Capitol Hill, and they do deals and bang heads together and get stuff done for the White House. They took one look at Kamala and then looked at Joe Biden's own history in Congress, going back all the way to 1972. And you know what they did? They sent her to do these things, and he went along too, to sit in the room. I mean, you can't imagine a more humiliating way of treating your vice president, number one, which was noted at the time, but also from their perspective, hang on a second, why would you send Kamala Harris, who exactly as you say had not done very much at that stage, when you got Joe Biden, and he knows everyone, and knows them personally, et cetera, et cetera. So that's always been a tension, actually, within their relationship. And Joe Biden's ability to hand over to other people. He didn't even do it with Obama, even when he worked for Obama, and I was there at that time, and there was always this tension. It was quite mostly good-natured, but there was always this tension, because you always felt that Biden actually thought, hey, kid, you're trying to be president, but I'm actually in charge here. And about that, Obama didn't like that, and there was always that thing going on between the two of them. Actually, still is, even in the last month
his
or so.
departure. The point I was just going to end on is I was watching a Saturday Night Live sketch yesterday on YouTube, which actually I do quite often, but from its glory days, 2020, when an amazing cast, and it was really funny. And it was the Democratic Party primary debate when there was loads of them. Tulsi Gabbard, remember her, Pete Buttigieg, all of them were there. And Biden is there, played by Jason Sudeikis, and Kamala Harris is there, played by Maya Rudolph. And the joke about Joe Biden is that he tells these long, rambling stories. It's like, I can't tell if this is a story from my life or from it's a movie or cartoon. And you're like, oh, yeah, they were talking about this stuff a long time ago. And then Kamala Harris is there. She's like, I'm not trying to make myself into a meme, as she pulls a very memeable face or says a very memeable thing. And it's weirdly, sometimes SNL, they are geniuses and they get there years before the rest of us. Anyway, Justin, lovely to do another collaboration with you.
Yep, real pleasure. And we're going to be back on Americast to talk about money, because it's a really important thing now. Can this race be bought by one side or the other? Because there is an absolute ton of money coming into the system, fresh money on the part of Kamala Harris as well. Does that really make a difference? We're going to delve into campaign finances and the many, many millions of dollars. Can an American election be bought? So get in touch. The WhatsApp, 44330 9480. It's americast@bbc.co.uk. The hashtag's Americast. Discord, link in description. It says here, I still don't know what that means. Hear Americast first and in full as a podcast on BBC Sounds. See you all later.
And there'll be another newscast along when there's some news. Bye.
Bye.
Americast.
Americast from BBC News.